Before anyone realized something was wrong, it had already begun. Chipo thought it was bad luck, a loss she could not explain, something life had taken without warning. But by the time she understood the truth, it was already too late. Because some things don't enter your life loudly, they come quietly, patiently. And by the time you see them clearly, they are already inside. When her baby died, Chipo believed it was just bad luck, something unfortunate but explainable, something that could happen once and never again. She had no reason to think it would repeat itself, no reason to imagine that her life was already beginning to shift in a way she could not yet understand. She told herself that these things happened, that not every story ended the way people hoped, and that sometimes loss came without meaning. But after her fourth baby died, something inside her began to change, and for the first time, she started to understand that what she was experiencing was not ordinary. It felt wrong, not just painful, but unnatural in a way she could not explain. As though something beyond her control had entered her life and had quietly taken hold. The thought stayed with her, growing stronger the more she tried to dismiss it, until it settled into her mind as something darker than bad luck. And yet, even with that feeling, she could not walk away because there was nowhere else for her to go and no clear explanation she could hold on to. Her life had not started that way. It had started in the city on a quiet evening that looked no different from any other, before anything had begun to feel uncertain. Chipo was walking home from work, moving quickly through the crowded streets as she always did, surrounded by the noise and movement of a place that never seemed to slow down. The city was loud, restless, and alive, in a way that left no space for weakness, and no time to stop and think about things that could not be changed. Buses roared past, vendors called out, and people pushed forward as if time itself was chasing them. She held her bag tightly under her arm and kept her eyes ahead, focused only on getting home. She came from a poor family, the kind that survived one day at a time, without ever feeling certain about the next. At home, everything was stretched. Food was shared carefully. Money was counted more than once. And even small problems carried the weight of something much larger. Her father had grown quieter over the years, worn down by effort that never seemed to pay off, while her mother worked constantly, selling what she could and saving what little came in, always hoping that something would eventually change. Chipo carried that hope within her, but it did not feel like hope anymore. It felt like responsibility, something heavy and constant that followed her everywhere. She worked in a small beauty shop where the hours were long and the pay was never enough. Yet she continued to show up, telling herself that endurance would lead somewhere better, even if she could not see how. That evening, her feet ached, and she had eaten very little, already thinking about what she could take home. Then she saw it, a car parked near the curb. It stood out, not because it was flashy, but because it carried a quiet kind of wealth, the kind that did not need to prove itself. A man stood beside it, older, well-dressed, and completely at ease, as though the chaos around him did not concern him at all. Chipo glanced at him, then looked away, assuming he was waiting for someone else, someone who belonged in his world and not hers. She had almost passed him when he spoke. He told her she had dropped something, and when she checked, she realized he was right. It was a small, insignificant thing, but he had noticed. She thanked him, expecting the moment to end there, but it didn't. He spoke again, calmly, without pressure, mentioning the danger of walking alone as though it was a simple fact, not a warning or a demand. He introduced himself formally, creating distance rather than familiarity, and that alone made the moment feel slightly unusual. Then he offered her money for transport. She hesitated, caught between instinct and need, unsure of how to respond. But when she did not immediately accept, he did not insist or argue. Instead, he placed the money nearby and walked away. That moment stayed with her because it felt quietly unsettling in a way she could not immediately explain. Men who wanted something usually made their intentions clear, making sure you understood what was expected in return. But this man had done the opposite. She took the money only after he had gone, and when she brought it home, it became food for her family, something immediate and necessary that made the moment feel easier to accept. She told herself it meant nothing, just a lucky encounter, something that would not matter beyond that day. But later, she found herself thinking about him more than she had expected, and that alone felt slightly strange. A few days later, she saw him again. This time, he was inside a restaurant. She had never entered this restaurant before, and when their eyes met, he did not look surprised, as though he had expected to see her. She should have walked away, and part of her knew that clearly, but she didn't. He invited her to join him, and she hesitated, aware of the stories she had heard about men who used generosity as a trap. And yet something inside her pushed her forward anyway. Inside, everything changed, and the difference was immediate. The air was cooler, the space was quieter, and the movement controlled, creating a sense of order that felt completely separate from the world outside. He ordered food for her carefully, as though he already knew what she needed. And he asked about her life in a way that felt attentive but measured. But when she asked about him, his answers became limited, controlled in a way that gave just enough to continue the conversation while revealing very little. When the meal ended, he drove her part of the way home, and before she stepped out, he gave her something, a small package. Inside it was a phone, not cheap, not second-hand, but something clearly valuable, something she could never have afforded on her own. And that's how it began, not as something dramatic or obvious, but as something quiet and gradual. At first, it felt harmless, but slowly her world began to change. Life did not change all at once for Chipo. It shifted slowly, almost gently, in a way that made it difficult to notice how far she had drifted from where she started, because nothing felt sudden enough to question. At first, she lived between two worlds, moving between them without fully understanding how different they were. In one world, she remained the same girl, waking early, helping her mother, counting money before leaving the house, and returning at night to the familiar rhythm of struggle that had always defined her life. In the other world, everything simply worked, as though problems no longer had time to grow and discomfort could be quietly removed before it took hold. Tatenda belonged entirely to that second world, and little by little, he began to pull her into it, not through force, but through consistency and ease. Their meetings became more frequent, and what had once been occasional slowly became routine, blending into her life so naturally that she stopped noticing the shift. He would call, and without thinking too deeply about it, she began to adjust her life around him. If he suggested dinner, she agreed. And if he made plans for her, she followed because resisting never felt necessary. It began to feel natural, as though he understood something about her life that she did not, and as though following his lead required less effort than questioning it. He never rushed her or raised his voice, and he never made demands in a way that could easily be resisted. Instead, he guided things quietly, with a calm certainty that made his influence difficult to recognize. And by the time she became aware of it, she was already following him. At the beauty shop, she started missing work. And at first, she had reasons that made sense, such as family matters or illness, explanations that allowed her to justify the change. However, over time, even those excuses began to fade. Because the truth was becoming harder to ignore, she no longer needed the job. The money he gave her was more than she earned in weeks, and the difference it made was immediate. One day, without fully deciding not to do so, she simply stopped going to work. Her boss complained at first, and then replaced her. But Chipo told herself it did not matter, because for the first time, there was food in the house, bills were paid, and there was space to breathe. Her parents did not question it. Her mother saw it as a blessing and spoke about how God had remembered them, while her father said very little, but accepted the help without resistance. Slowly, what might once have raised concern became accepted, not because it was understood, but because it solved too many problems to be challenged. Yet not everything changed in ways she could understand. She began to see her friends less, and at first it was because she was busy. But over time, it became clear that their conversations no longer fit into her life the same way. Without noticing the exact moment it happened, she began to drift away from them, not through conflict, but through distance. Tatenda never told her to stop seeing them, and he did not need to, because he filled her time so completely that there was no space left for anyone else. And what had once been important slowly became secondary. There was something else as well, something quieter but more persistent. He never met her family. Whenever she suggested it, he agreed in principle but delayed the moment, always calmly and always with reasons that sounded reasonable. He would say there was time or that things should not be rushed, and each time she accepted it, because nothing in his tone suggested urgency or refusal. At the same time, he continued to support her family from a distance, paying for things at home without ever stepping into that space, as though he preferred to remain just outside it. At first, she did not question this, because it was easier to accept what was working than to examine it too closely. But there was one thing that never changed. He still did not touch her. Not at the beginning, not as time passed, and not even after months turned into a year. And the longer it continued, the more difficult it became to ignore. At first, she told herself it was a good sign, that it meant he was different, that he respected her in a way other men did not. But as time passed, that explanation began to weaken, and she started to wonder. A year was a long time for a man to give so much and take nothing, and the imbalance began to feel less like kindness and more like something she could not explain. Slowly, her thoughts began to change, shifting from acceptance to quiet suspicion. She began to watch him more closely, paying more attention to details she had once ignored, noticing how nothing about him felt accidental. The way he spoke, the way he listened, and the way he reacted all seemed deliberate, as though even his kindness was carefully measured. Sometimes, when they sat together in silence, she felt something else she could not describe, as though he was not simply present with her, but observing her in a way that went beyond attention. The feeling lingered, settling into her thoughts as something she could not dismiss, until it became clear that he was not just with her, but quietly observing her. One evening, she finally asked him what he really wanted from her. And although her voice remained steady, there was something beneath it that revealed her uncertainty. He did not answer immediately, and when he finally spoke, his response was calm, almost reassuring, telling her that she was worried too much and that she should learn to accept good things when they came to her. It sounded like an answer, but it explained nothing, and the lack of clarity only made her more aware of what was missing. She nodded, outwardly accepting what he had said, but inside, the unease remained, and this time it did not fade. Time passed, and from the outside, everything appeared to make sense, as people saw what they expected to see and filled in the rest with assumptions that felt comfortable. But Chipo knew something they did not, because she was living inside it. There were gaps, and the more she noticed them, the harder they became to ignore. Then one day, something changed. Tatenda told her he wanted to meet her parents, and for a brief moment, she felt a sense of relief, as though something uncertain was finally becoming real. But beneath that feeling, something else remained, something quieter and more persistent, because even then, she could not shake the sense that everything unfolding around her was carefully arranged and that she was not the one deciding where it would lead. Chipo did not sleep well the night before, and the longer she lay awake, the more her thoughts circled around the same questions without finding any sense of resolution. What was meant to be a simple introduction had begun to feel heavier in her mind, as though it carried more meaning than she could fully explain. It was supposed to be straightforward, just an opportunity for her parents to meet the man who had changed her life. Yet something about it felt quietly important, in a way that made it difficult for her to rest. By morning, the atmosphere in the house had already shifted. Her mother moved quickly from one task to another, cleaning things that did not need cleaning and checking details that were already in place, as though she was trying to control something she could not fully name. Her father said very little, but he remained nearby, watching with a quiet attentiveness that made the moment feel more serious than it should have been. Chipo dressed carefully, choosing something modest that would not draw attention, because despite everything that had changed in her life, she did not want to appear too different from who she had been before. Even so, she could feel a quiet tension building inside her, something she could not easily ignore. Then she heard it, the sound of cars approaching, more than one. Her heartbeat quickened as the sound grew louder, and when she stepped outside, she expected to see Tatenda alone. Instead, what she saw made her pause, because there were 3 cars, and the presence of the others immediately changed the meaning of the moment. Tatenda stepped out of the first car, calm and composed, exactly as she had come to expect. But the men who followed from the other vehicles brought with them a sense of purpose that made everything feel suddenly different. They began unloading items, carrying packages that were carefully wrapped and placing them in front of the house, each movement deliberate and organized. Chipo stood still, watching, trying to understand what she was seeing. But the more she observed, the clearer it became that this was not a simple visit. Something about it felt structured, as though everything had been planned in advance. Her parents came outside, and the moment they saw what was happening, their expressions changed, shifting from curiosity to something deeper that quickly settled into acceptance. Tatenda greeted them calmly and respectfully, speaking with a confidence that suggested he was not there to ask, but to confirm something already decided. The gifts continued to appear: food, money, clothing, each one adding weight to the moment and making it harder to question what was unfolding. Chipo felt something shift, not just in the situation, but within herself, as the realization began to take shape. This was no longer an introduction. Then Tatenda spoke, and when he did, his words were clear and direct, leaving no room for misunderstanding, as he stated that he had come to marry her. The impact of those words settled heavily, and Chipo felt the moment change completely, as everything she had expected seemed to fall away. This was not how things were supposed to happen, and the speed of it all made it difficult for her to think clearly, because everything was moving too fast. She turned to her parents, waiting for them to question him, to slow things down, or to ask for time, but instead they listened carefully, And as they did, their hesitation began to fade. Tatenda spoke about stability and provision, about the life he could offer, and he did not need to persuade them, because everything he said was already visible in front of them. The evidence was there, undeniable and immediate. Chipo tried to speak, trying to find words that would allow her to pause what was happening, but her voice felt small, lost beneath the weight of the moment and the expectations forming around her. The decision was no longer hers, and the realization came quietly but firmly, settling into her thoughts as she watched events unfold around her without her control. Her parents began to agree, at first cautiously, and then with increasing certainty, their years of struggle shaping their response in a way that made resistance unlikely. For them, this was not simply a proposal, but an answer to problems they had lived with for far too long. Chipo felt herself being carried forward by something she could not stop. And before she could fully process what was happening, everything was decided. There would be no waiting, no preparation, and no time to consider what it all meant. She stood there, trying to steady herself, aware that something about the situation felt deeply wrong, even if she could not explain why. When she looked at Tatenda, searching for hesitation or uncertainty, she found none, and his calm expression only made the moment feel more controlled, more deliberate, as though everything was unfolding exactly as he intended. When she turned back to her parents, she saw something that affected her more than anything else: relief. Not just acceptance, but genuine relief, as though a burden had been lifted from them in a way they could not deny. Understanding that made it harder to resist, because she could see why they felt that way, even if she could not fully accept it herself. The rest of the day moved quickly, filled with arrangements and quiet instructions, each moment passing without pause, until it no longer felt like something she was part of, but something she was being moved through, as though trying to express something that could not be said. When it was time to leave, her mother held her tightly, as though trying to express something that could not be said aloud, while her father placed a hand on her shoulder with a quiet finality that made it clear the decision would not be reversed. Chipo stepped into the car, and as it pulled away, she looked back at the house, at everything she had known, and felt a growing sense of distance that seemed to separate her from it even before she had fully left. It already felt distant, as though the life she was leaving behind had begun to fade the moment the decision was made. She told herself she was moving forward, that this was right, that everything happening was leading her toward something better. Yet the feeling inside her refused to settle, because beneath those thoughts was something she could not ignore, something that felt wrong. And for the first time, she allowed herself to fully recognize it, understanding that she had stepped into something she did not understand. And whatever it was, it had already begun to close around her. The journey to Tatenda's home was longer than Chipo expected, and as the distance stretched out, the world around her began to change in ways that felt gradual but unmistakable. The noise of the city slowly faded. The crowded streets gave way to quieter roads, and the movement that had once surrounded her disappeared until everything became quiet in a way that felt deeper than simple silence. By the time they arrived, the house stood behind high walls, large and perfectly maintained, carrying a presence that suggested a kind of quiet authority rather than display. It was the kind of place that did not need to prove its wealth, because it was already evident in everything around it. As the gate opened and the car moved inside, Chipo found herself looking around carefully, taking in the stillness of the space, noticing how everything appeared neat, ordered, and untouched. There was nothing obviously wrong, and yet something about it felt wrong. Not in a way she could immediately define, but in a way that settled quietly into her thoughts. Inside, the silence changed. It became heavier, more present, as though it was not simply the absence of sound, but something that existed on its own. There were no voices, no signs of movement, and no indication that anyone else lived in the house, which made the house feel strangely empty despite its size. Tatenda guided her through the rooms, moving with calm familiarity, showing her everything with a quiet precision that made it clear he was entirely comfortable in the space. Every room was perfect, arranged carefully, with nothing out of place, yet none of it felt lived in, as though the house existed without the presence of everyday life. As they continued down a long corridor, they eventually reached a single door at the far end. At first, it looked ordinary, no different from the others she had seen, but something about it made her pause. A quiet instinct that surfaced without explanation. Before she could ask about it, Tatenda stopped, and when he spoke, his tone had changed, shifting from the calm ease she was used to into something firmer and more deliberate. He told her there were rules. The words themselves were simple, but the way he said them carried a weight that made it clear they were not open for discussion. He explained that everything in the house was done in a certain way, and as he spoke, his voice remained calm. Yet there was a finality in it that made it difficult to question. Then he told her that she was not to enter that room. There was no explanation offered, and when she asked why, he told her she did not need to know, delivering the response in a way that made it clear that the subject was closed. He continued, outlining more rules, explaining that she was not to leave the house without informing him, and that she was not to bring visitors. Each instruction was given calmly, without force, and yet the structure of it all made it feel increasingly controlled. Then he added something else, something that stopped her thoughts completely. He told her that she was not allowed to bathe unless he gave permission. For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood, because the rule felt too unusual to accept immediately. She asked him to repeat it, hoping she had heard him incorrectly, but he said it again, clearly and without hesitation. She tried to understand it, asking why such a rule would exist, but he did not provide any explanation. Instead, He told her she would understand in time. The response did nothing to reduce the unease growing inside her, because it was not normal. No matter how calmly it was presented, it did not make sense. She looked at him, searching for something that might soften the moment, but his expression remained steady, giving her nothing to question or challenge. When she tried again, he reminded her that she was now his wife and that she should respect his wishes. And although his tone remained calm, there was something heavier beneath it, something that made it difficult to push back. She nodded, not because she fully accepted what he had said, but because resisting did not feel possible in that moment. That night, as she lay in the bedroom, the silence of the house felt more noticeable than before. It was not just quiet, but complete, as though the space itself existed without interruption. And the longer she listened, the more she became aware of the absence of life. The feeling grew stronger as time passed, making it difficult for her to relax, until eventually she stood up and stepped into the corridor, drawn forward by something she could not fully explain. She moved slowly, aware of each step, as though the house itself might respond to her presence. And when she reached the door again, she stopped, listening carefully. There was nothing at first, no sound, no movement. The silence did not feel empty. It instead carried a presence that felt deeply wrong, as though something existed just beyond her awareness. She remained there for a moment, trying to understand what she was feeling, but no clear answer came. Eventually, she stepped back, choosing to return to her room, though the unease followed her. When she lay down again, her thoughts refused to settle, because something in that house was not right. And even though she could not explain it, she could feel it clearly. It was there, growing and waiting. The days that followed did not unfold in the way Chipo expected. And although she tried at first to convince herself that everything would settle with time, the unease she carried did not fade, and instead began to take root in a way that made it impossible to ignore. What she had hoped would feel like adjustment began to feel like something else entirely, something slower and more deliberate, as though her life inside the house was being shaped in ways she could not fully understand. Tatenda remained calm and consistent, never raising his voice and never behaving in a way that could easily be questioned. Yet the more she observed him, the more she noticed that everything around her felt quietly controlled, as though each part of her environment had been arranged with intention. He provided for her, ensuring there was food, comfort, and stability. And on the surface, nothing seemed lacking. Yet beneath that, something felt incomplete in a way that made her feel increasingly uneasy. She began to notice patterns in his behavior, in the way he moved through the house at certain times and avoided particular spaces, and in the way silence seemed to return the moment he left a room. It was not chaotic or unpredictable, but precise. And that precision made it harder for her to dismiss what she was feeling. She tried to follow the rules he had given her, telling herself it was easier that way, easier to avoid conflict and easier to maintain a sense of stability. However, some of these rules stayed with her more than others, lingering in her thoughts long after they were spoken, and one in particular refused to leave her mind: the rule about not bathing. At first, she avoided thinking about it too much, convincing herself there must be a reason behind it, something personal or cultural that she simply did not yet understand. But as time passed, that explanation became harder to accept, because the rule did not feel like guidance, but like a boundary, something fixed and deliberate that she was not meant to cross. One evening, after spending most of the day alone in the house, she felt the weight of that boundary more strongly than before. The air seemed heavier, the silence more present, and she became aware of herself in a way that made her uncomfortable, as though she was being observed even in stillness. In that moment, the need to bathe became less like routine and more like a need to feel normal, to reclaim some part of herself that still belonged to her. She stood for a long moment at the entrance of the bathroom, her thoughts moving between hesitation and resistance, as she considered whether to follow the rule or to act on instinct. The longer she stood there, the more she became aware that the decision itself carried weight, and that choosing to step forward meant crossing something she could not easily return from. Eventually, she moved. The step was small, but the meaning behind it felt significant. And as she entered the room, she felt a quiet tension settle into her body. At first, nothing changed. The space remained still, just like every other part of the house. And when she turned on the water, the sound filled the silence in a way she felt almost relieving. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel that sense of relief, as though everything might still be ordinary. But it did not last. Something shifted. It was subtle, almost unrecognizable, like a change in the air rather than sound. Yet it carried a presence that was impossible to ignore. The feeling settled over her slowly, and as it did, it became clear that something in the house had become aware. Her body reacted immediately, freezing in place before her thoughts could catch up. And as the water continued to run, the sense of unease returned stronger than before, wrapping around her awareness in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. In that moment, she understood something instinctively, not through sight or sound, but through a feeling that settled into her with certainty. She was not alone. The realization came quickly, and she turned off the water without hesitation, allowing the silence to return. This time, however, it was heavier, more present, as though it carried meaning. She stood still, listening, trying to convince herself that nothing had changed. Yet the feeling remained, sharp and deeply wrong, refusing to fade. Slowly, she stepped back, leaving the bathroom with controlled movements, as though any sudden action might draw attention to herself. When she reached the corridor, she paused, her heart beating faster as she tried to steady her thoughts and understand what she had just experienced. It was not fear in the usual sense, but something deeper, something that told her that she had crossed a line she was not meant to cross. And even though nothing visible had happened, she knew something had changed. When Tatenda returned that night, his behavior appeared unchanged at first. He greeted her calmly, his expression steady, and for a brief moment, she wondered if everything she had felt had been imagined. But as the evening continued, she began to notice small differences in the way he looked at her. His gaze lingered slightly longer than before, and the way his silence seemed more deliberate. When he asked her how her day had been, the question sounded ordinary, yet something in the way he asked it made her hesitate. She answered carefully, choosing her words with caution, avoiding anything that might reveal what she had done. He listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and then, without raising his voice or altering his tone, he reminded her about the rules in a way that was calm, yet precise enough to make the meaning unmistakably clear. He did not accuse her directly. He did not need to, because the certainty in his voice made it clear that he knew. The realization settled slowly, becoming impossible to ignore, and with it came a deep sense of unease that she could not shake. She lowered her eyes, her thoughts racing as she tried to understand how he could have known, yet no explanation came. He did not question her further, and he did not explain himself. Instead, he allowed the silence between them to grow, and in that silence, she felt the full weight of what had just happened. This was not just a house. It was not just a life she had entered. It was something else entirely, something she did not understand, but was already inside. And whatever it was not passive. It was aware, and it was watching her. The days that followed began to take on a pattern, but it was not one that brought Chipo any sense of comfort. Instead, it felt deliberate, almost calculated, as though each moment inside the house was unfolding according to something she could not see or understand. What might have once felt like routine now carried a weight that made her increasingly aware of how little control she truly had. Tatenda remained consistent in his behavior, calm, composed, and measured in everything he did, never raising his voice and never acting in a way that could easily be challenged. He continued to provide for her, ensuring that nothing she needed was ever lacking. Yet the more he gave, the more she felt a quiet sense of distance growing between them, as though his presence defined the space rather than shared it. She began to notice how the house seemed to respond to him, how everything felt still when he was there, and how the silence returned the moment he left, settling into the rooms in a way that felt heavier each time. It was not simply quiet, but controlled, as though the space itself existed under a constant order that never shifted. At first, she tried to dismiss the feeling, telling herself that she was overthinking, that the unease came from adjusting to a new life. However, the feeling did not pass. It lingered, patient and constant, settling into her thoughts as something she could not fully ignore. She found herself watching him more closely, paying attention to the details she had once overlooked, noticing the way he moved through certain areas of the house without hesitation, while avoiding others entirely. It was not random, and the more she observed, the clearer it became that his actions were deliberate, guided by something she could not see. More than that, She began to feel that he was aware of her movements, even when he was not near her. And that awareness unsettled her deeply, creating the persistent sense that she was never truly alone, even in silence. One afternoon, that feeling became impossible to ignore, and she found herself wanting to test it, not out of confidence, but out of a need to understand whether what she felt was real. She told herself it was something small, something harmless. Yet even as she thought it, she knew the decision carried weight. She moved towards the corridor again, drawn by the same quiet force she had tried to resist before. And as she approached it, the air began to feel different, heavier and more intense, as though the space itself recognized her presence. For a moment, she paused, aware that she could still turn back, that she did not have to continue. But the thought did not hold, and instead she stepped forward, crossing into the corridor with a sense of tension that settled immediately into her body. The silence deepened around her as she moved further in, and the sound of her own footsteps seemed louder than it should have been, echoing faintly along the narrow space. By the time she reached the door, her heartbeat had become steady but heavy, each beat reinforcing the growing tension inside her. She stopped just in front of it and listened carefully. But there was no sound and no movement, nothing that could confirm what she had felt before. Yet the silence carried a presence that was impossible to ignore, as though something existed just beyond her reach. She raised her hand slowly, holding it just above the surface of the door, close enough to feel a faint chill radiating from it. Her fingers trembled slightly, not only from fear, but from a deeper instinct that told her she was standing too close to something she did not understand. Even then, she did not step away, and instead she pressed her hand against the door, testing it gently. It did not move. The resistance was firm and absolute, as though it had been sealed with intention rather than simply locked. She tried again, this time applying a little more force, but the result was the same, and the door remained completely closed. A feeling of frustration began to rise within her, mixed with a growing unease, because it was not only that the door would not open, but the way it refused to respond at all, as though it was meant to remain closed in every sense. She stepped back slowly, her thoughts racing as she tried to understand what it meant, and the question formed in her mind before she could stop it. Why forbid something so strongly if there was nothing to hide? As that thought settled, another followed, quieter but more unsettling, shaping itself into something she could not easily dismiss. What if the door was not there to keep her out, but to keep something in? The idea took hold immediately, and once it did, it refused to leave, staying with her as she turned away from the door and made her way back down the corridor, carrying with it a growing sense of unease. That night, the house felt different again. The silence was no longer just heavy, but closer, as though it had shifted inwards, reducing the space around her and making it harder to breathe comfortably. She lay awake, listening carefully, becoming aware of every small sound, every movement of air, until the quiet itself began to feel unnatural. At some point, she thought she heard something. It was faint at first, so faint that she almost dismissed it. But it came again, slightly clearer this time, enough to confirm that it was real. Her body reacted immediately, her breath tightening as she remained still, listening closely and trying to determine where the sound was coming from. But the house seemed to absorb it, making it difficult to place. Then she realized something that made her chest tighten, understanding that the sound was coming from the corridor, from the direction of the door. A cold sensation moved through her as the realization settled, bringing back the memory of the rule, the warning, and the firmness in Tatenda's voice. She did not move. Every instinct told her to remain where she was and to ignore what she was hearing. Yet the sound came again, soft but persistent, carrying a quality that made it feel unmistakably alive. She remained frozen, caught between fear and the need to understand, because whatever was behind that door was not silent, and it was not empty. For the first time, she began to understand that the rules she had been given were not only about control, but about protection, and the meaning of that realization settled heavily into her thoughts. The days that followed did not return to anything Chipo could recognize as normal, and whatever fragile sense of balance she had been holding on to began to slip further with each passing moment. The house no longer felt like a place she was learning to live in. Instead, it felt like something she was slowly being drawn into, something that observed, responded, and adjusted in ways that made her increasingly aware of herself. She became more conscious of her movements, noticing how she walked, where she stood, and how long she remained in certain places, as though these details mattered more than they should. It was not something Tatenda explained or even mentioned, yet the feeling settled into her thoughts with quiet persistence, growing into a constant sensitivity to everything around her. Tatenda himself remained outwardly unchanged, calm, measured, and controlled, never raising his voice and never behaving in a way that could easily be challenged. However, there was something different beneath that consistency, something subtle but unmistakable, as though his attention had sharpened and become more deliberately focused on her. It showed in the way he looked at her sometimes, holding his gaze just long enough to make her feel uncomfortable, and in the way he seemed to pause before speaking, choosing his words with careful precision. None of it was aggressive, yet it carried a quiet intensity that made her feel increasingly exposed. She made a deliberate effort to avoid the corridor, keeping her distance from the part of the house that had begun to dominate her thoughts. At first, this avoidance was intentional. Sometimes she reminded herself to do it, but over time it became instinctive, as though her body had learned the boundaries without needing to think about them. Even so, the memory of the sound did not leave her. It lingered in her mind, returning in moments of silence and pressing itself into her thoughts when the house became too still. The idea that something existed behind that door, something capable of making a sound, something that might be alive, refused to fade. One evening, as the light outside began to disappear and the house settled into its familiar stillness, she found herself listening more closely than usual, as though she were waiting for something without admitting it to herself. The silence felt different, heavier and more deliberate, carrying a sense of quiet expectation that made it difficult to relax. At first, there was nothing unusual, only the faint sounds of the house settling and the distant movement of air through unseen spaces. Then, gradually, something else emerged, a faint and irregular sound that she recognized immediately, even before she truly processed it. It was the same sound. This time, however, it did not vanish quickly. Instead, it lingered, low and uneven, as though whatever was producing it was shifting or reacting in some way. The longer she listened, the clearer it became, until there was no doubt left in her mind that it was real. Her body tensed, and without thinking, she held her breath, as though even the smallest movement might interrupt what she was hearing. When the sound came again, slightly stronger this time, it brought with it a new sensation, something deeper than fear, something closer to recognition. It felt as though part of her understood that this was not random, not accidental, that whatever existed behind that door was not simply present, but actively aware of its surroundings. The thought settled into her mind with a quiet certainty, and she realized that she was not just hearing something, but experiencing something that was responding in its own way. As she shifted slightly, adjusting her position without thinking, the sound stopped completely. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute, and it struck her with a sharpness that made her heart begin to race. She remained still, her thoughts moving quickly as she tried to make sense of what had just happened, yet the connection felt too precise to ignore. It felt as though the sound had stopped because of her. That possibility settled into her chest with a weight that grew heavier the longer she considered it, bringing with it the unsettling sense that she had not just been listening, but that something else had been listening as well. The house, already silent, now felt distinctly watchful, no longer subtle in its presence, but quietly alert. She stood slowly, her movements controlled, as though she were trying not to disturb the space around her. Every instinct told her to remain where she was and to avoid the corridor entirely. But another force pressed against that instinct, something quieter yet stronger. It was not curiosity alone. It was something deeper. Before she could fully think it through, she found herself moving towards the corridor once again, each step deliberate, each movement carrying a weight she could not ignore. As she reached the entrance, she noticed immediately that the air felt different, colder and more still, with a density that made it feel more intense than the rest of the house. For a brief moment, she hesitated, aware that she could still turn back and that she did not need to continue. However, that thought passed quickly and she stepped forward. The silence deepened as she moved further in, and the sound of her own footsteps seemed louder than it should have been, echoing faintly in the narrow space. By the time she reached the door, her heartbeat had become steady but heavy, each beat reinforcing the tension building within her. She raised her hand slowly, holding it just above the surface of the door, close enough to feel a faint chill radiating from it. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from a deeper instinct that told her she was standing too close to something she did not understand. But even so, she did not step away. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, focusing on the silence, searching for any sign that what she had heard before was still there. For several seconds, nothing happened, and she almost convinced herself that she had imagined the earlier moment. Then something shifted. The movement was faint but unmistakable, not outside the door, but within it, as though something on the other side had adjusted its position. This time, there was no uncertainty. She felt it clearly. Something was there, not distant, not hidden, but close, and closer than it had been before. Chipo froze as the full weight of that realization settled over her, and in that moment, she understood with complete certainty that she had never imagined any of it. Whatever was behind that door was not only alive, but was fully aware, and now, unmistakably, it was aware of her. The night did not end when the sound faded, and even after the house returned to silence, Chipo could not convince herself that everything had gone back to normal. The stillness around her no longer felt empty, but filled with something she could not see, something that remained present in a way that made it impossible for her to relax. And as she lay awake listening, she became aware that the sound itself now carried a kind of meaning she had never recognized before. Sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, it was shallow and uncertain, broken by the persistent sense that something in the house was no longer passive. By morning, the weight of exhaustion settled over her, yet it did nothing to dull the memory of what she had heard, because that sound had not felt random, but deliberate, as though it had come from something capable of intention. Tatenda behaved as he always did, calm and composed, speaking in the same measured tone and showing no visible sign that anything had changed. Yet the more she observed him, the more she became aware of something beneath the surface, something that had already been there but was now impossible to ignore. His presence no longer felt simply controlled. It felt quietly knowing, as though he existed within the house in a way she did not understand. She tried to move through the day as though nothing had happened, keeping her distance from the corridor and forcing her thoughts away whenever they drifted towards it. But avoidance did not bring relief. Instead, it made her more aware of the tension, because the effort to suppress it only made it feel more real. As the day passed, she noticed something else, something subtle but deeply unsettling, because the house itself no longer felt the same. The silence was not distant anymore, but closer and more immediate, as though it surrounded her more tightly than before, and it became harder to ignore, the growing sense that she was not just aware of the house, but that the house itself was aware of her. That awareness followed her from room to room, settling into her thoughts and making it difficult for her to focus on anything else, until she found herself listening without intending to, waiting for a sound that might confirm what she already suspected, while at the same time hoping that nothing would come. As evening approached and the light began to fade, a familiar unease returned, and the transition from day to night felt more significant than it should have, as though something shifted within the darkness, making the house feel more active, even in stillness. Tatenda remained unchanged, his movements steady and his voice calm. Yet the contrast between him and the space around them became more pronounced, and the fact that he appeared unaffected only made her more aware that whatever was happening did not follow rules she could understand. She tried to speak to him, to ask questions in a way that would not sound direct, but each attempt faded before it formed, because something about him made it difficult to push beyond the surface. It was not only fear, but something deeper, something that made resistance feel both necessary and impossible at the same time. Later that night, after he had moved to another part of the house, the silence returned completely, settling into every corner with a weight that pressed against her thoughts. And as she sat listening, her body grew tense without her consciously deciding it. After some time, a faint sound began to form within that silence, subtle at first, almost indistinguishable, but growing clearer as it repeated, until it became impossible for her to dismiss it, and she understood with certainty that it was real. Her heart began to beat faster as she remained completely still, listening carefully while the sound continued in an uneven pattern, carrying with it a quality that made it feel distinguishably alive. And the longer she listened, the stronger the sense of presence became, as though whatever was behind that door was no longer distant, but moving closer in a way she could not explain. Without fully deciding to act, she stood, the movement driven by something deeper than conscious thought, and before she could stop herself, she began to move toward the corridor again, each step feeling heavier as the air around her grew colder and more intense, pressing against her senses. When she reached the entrance to the corridor, she paused briefly, aware that she could still turn back and avoid what she already suspected. But that moment passed quickly, and she continued forward, drawn by something stronger than hesitation. The silence deepened as she moved further in, and the sound became clearer, guiding her in a way that left no doubt about its source, until she reached the door and stopped, her breathing slowing down into a focused rhythm that sharpened her awareness of everything around her. She stood there listening, and this time the sound did not fade, but remained present, closer and more defined, making it impossible for her to deny what she was hearing or what it meant. Her hand lifted slowly, hovering just above the surface of the door, where she could feel a faint chill radiating through it. And although her fingers trembled, she did not pull back, because something within her hand had already crossed the point of hesitation. As she leaned closer, the sound shifted again, not fading, but moving, and the change was subtle yet unmistakable, as though something on the other side had responded to her presence. The realization struck her immediately, settling into her chest with a weight that made it difficult to breathe, because she understood then that whatever was behind that door was not only present, but aware, and that it knew she was there. The moment stretched, heavy and unmoving, as every instinct told her to step back and break the connection, yet her body resisted, held in place by the intensity of what she was experiencing. The sound came again, closer than before, carrying with it a sense of danger that was no longer distant or uncertain, and in that moment, something changed. The door shifted slightly beneath her hand, not opening, but moving just enough for her to feel it, enough to make it clear that whatever was behind it was capable of reaching towards her. The movement stopped almost immediately, but the meaning remained, settling into her thoughts with a clarity that left no room for doubt, because this was no longer something hidden or contained, but something close, something aware, and something beginning to respond. Chipo stepped back, the motion sudden and instinctive, her breath returning in a sharp rush as the full weight of what had just happened settled over her. And in that moment, she understood that whatever was behind that door was not as contained as she had believed. It was closer. Whatever was behind that door was no longer waiting, and Chipo was no longer alone. What had begun quietly had already started to change. Something was unfolding, something she did not understand, and it was not going to stop. This was only the beginning. Episode 2 is where everything changes.